January 9th, 1945. The hour was still wrapped in darkness, the kind of deep winter silence where the cold itself seemed to press against the lungs of every living thing. In the ruins of Hatton, a small French village ground down by artillery and frost, a single American sergeant lay waiting. His body was stiff from the frozen mud, his breath shallow, his fingers clamped to the stock of a weapon that had already become an extension of his own will. His name was Vito Rocco Bertoldo, a man whose life up to this moment had been ordinary by every definition, until fate placed him in the path of 2 German divisions. He had been awake for hours, staring through the jagged hole where a bakery window had once let in the warmth of bread ovens and morning sun. Now it framed only smoke and the shifting silhouettes of men moving in the street, their helmets glinting faintly, their weapons ready. They were scouts, elite German soldiers hardened by campaigns stretching from Africa to Normandy, now driving forward under the banner of Operation Nordwind. Vito adjusted his glasses, cracked at the corner but still barely holding together, and steadied himself. He had already made his decision the night before. He would not abandon his position, even if he faced the weight of an army alone. The story of how this 30-year-old son of immigrants ended up in the shattered bones of Hatton could not be understood without looking back. Far before that frozen morning, he was born in Decatur, Illinois in 1916 to Italian parents who had crossed the Atlantic seeking the promise of a better life. His father, Rocco, labored deep in the coal mines that scarred the Midwest, while his mother, Mary, kept the family together until illness took her too soon. With 9 children to care for, the household often turned to orphanages for help. Young Vito grew up in an environment where toughness wasn't a choice. It was survival. By the time he was a teenager, he was swinging a pick underground, shoulders and lungs blackened by coal dust. His hands hardened early, his sense of endurance tested long before he wore a uniform. When war came to America in December 1941, he felt the same surge of duty that swept through thousands of others. But the Army doctor at the induction center in Chicago didn't see a soldier. He saw a liability. The thick glasses perched on Vito's nose, the squint of his eyes without them, were enough to classify him as unfit for combat. The dreaded 4F stamped his papers. Most men would have taken the rejection as final, but Vito carried the stubbornness of a miner. He accepted a role as a cook when he finally enlisted in 1942. But he kept pushing, filing petitions, volunteering, demanding reassessment. By the time the Army desperately needed riflemen after the bloodletting of Normandy and the breakout through France, he was given his chance. He joined the 242nd Infantry Regiment of the 42nd Division, the Rainbow Division, whose very name carried the legacy of the Great War. By the winter of 1944, Vito had proven himself in combat. He had risen through the ranks quickly, his superiors recognizing a man who refused to back down, no matter how heavy the fire. He had poor vision, yes, but he compensated with tenacity. He had weak academic records, but he carried the instincts of a fighter. He had no illusions about glory. What he had was an almost unshakable resolve to protect the men beside him. And in the end, that was why, when his battalion commander ordered a withdrawal from Hatton on January 8th, Vito volunteered to stay behind. Someone had to cover the retreat. He would not allow his comrades to be cut down as they pulled back. He knew exactly what it meant. His post could easily become his grave. Operation Nordwind itself was Hitler's last desperate throw of the dice on the Western Front, while the Ardennes offensive raged further north in what history remembers as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces in Alsace struck south in an attempt to crack the Allied line and threaten Strasbourg. If they succeeded, the American and French armies could be severed from each other, the Rhine once again threatened. For the Germans, it was a chance, slim but still a chance, to regain momentum. For the Americans, it was another bitter winter fight in towns most of them had never heard of before their maps ordered them there. Hatton was one such place. Small, unremarkable, but sitting on a crossroads that mattered. Whoever held it could control movement toward the Rhine's approaches. For days, shells had pounded its houses into rubble. By January 8th, Lieutenant Colonel Guy Kurtz, commander of the 1st Battalion, decided the command post had to be evacuated. Too many shells had landed close. Too many enemy movements were closing in. The staff, the wounded, and whatever communications they could salvage had to pull back to safer ground. But to get them out meant someone had to stay and keep the Germans occupied. Vito didn't hesitate. He had always been a volunteer, whether in the mines as a boy or the kitchens as a soldier. Now he volunteered for the loneliest duty of all. He checked his Browning .30 caliber machine gun, the water-cooled beast that spat out death at nearly 600 rounds per minute. Ammunition was limited to what could be scavenged from abandoned crates and fallen comrades, but it was enough to start. He positioned the weapon in the town hall, once a symbol of Hatton's civic pride, now a battered strongpoint. Through broken shutters and jagged walls, he traced the narrow street where the Germans would almost certainly come. Then he waited, cold, hungry, tired, but unflinching. The first German patrol appeared before dawn, 6 men moving cautiously through the debris-strewn street. Vito let them come within 30 yards, closer, closer still. Then his finger tightened on the trigger. The roar of the Browning shattered the silence, a stream of fire cutting down all 6 men before they had time to scatter. The burst lasted seconds, but it was enough to announce that Hatton was not abandoned. And with that, the fight began. Within minutes, fire poured back at him from every angle. Bullets cracked against stone, ricocheted off steel, smacked into wood. Mortar shells whistled in, blasting apart what walls still stood. Yet in the chaos, Vito did something extraordinary. Instead of clinging to the relative shelter of the building, he picked up the heavy machine gun and dragged it outside. He set it up in the middle of the street, directly under the glare of burning buildings, where every enemy eye could see him. To any soldier, such a move would seem suicidal. But for Vito, it was the only way to stop the flanking maneuvers he had spotted. From that exposed position, he raked the advancing Germans, mowing down assault groups before they could slip behind his post. The records later confirmed that he held that street for nearly 12 hours, shifting only when absolutely necessary. He was completely visible, his silhouette etched against firelight, his weapons spewing round after round as if the gun itself had decided not to yield. Enemy machine guns, rifles, even the dreaded 88s tried to silence him, but he kept firing, sometimes shifting the tripod, sometimes cooling the weapon as best he could, always ready for the next wave. The men who had retreated behind him heard the constant thud of the Browning and knew their sergeant was still alive. His presence bought them the time they needed to regroup further back. As afternoon light faded on January 9th, German commanders grew impatient. Infantry alone could not dislodge this stubborn machine gunner. They brought forward a tank, its turret swiveling toward the town hall. From point-blank range, it fired. The explosion hurled Vito across the room, stunning him, showering him with splinters and shrapnel. But when the smoke cleared, he staggered back to his feet, bleeding but still breathing. He picked up his weapon again, repositioned it, and waited. Soon after, 2 personnel carriers unloaded fresh squads of German infantry. With the tank covering them, they must have believed the fight was over. They poured into the street in formation, weapons ready. From his new perch inside a window, Vito opened fire once more, cutting them down before they could even spread out. More than half the group fell in seconds. The survivors scattered, shocked by the ferocity of resistance coming from what they surely thought was a shattered ruin. The tank commander, furious, ordered his gunner to fire again and again at the stubborn stronghold. Shells ripped apart walls, collapsed beams, sent furniture flying. One blast obliterated the machine gun completely, throwing Vito backward and leaving his ears ringing. But he refused to quit. Crawling through dust and blood, he found a cache of white phosphorus grenades. When the next squad advanced confidently, expecting silence from the ruins, Vito hurled the grenades into their midst. Flames and smoke consumed the street, and the Germans broke once again, retreating in confusion. By the time darkness fell on January 9th, he had been in continuous combat for nearly 20 hours. His glasses were bent, one lens cracked. His hands were blistered and burned from handling overheated barrels. His body carried shrapnel wounds, each movement sending jolts of pain. Yet he stayed at his post. For him, there was no alternative. If he left, the Germans would surge through and crush what remained of his battalion. So he fought on. January 10, 1945. The second day of the battle dawned with fire and thunder. The ruins of Hatton smoldered in the bitter Alsatian cold, walls collapsing into themselves, smoke twisting upward as if the entire town were exhaling its last breath. For Master Sergeant Vito Bertoldo, the new day brought no rest, no warmth, no reprieve. He had not slept since the night of January 8th. He had eaten almost nothing. His body was covered in shrapnel cuts and burns, his uniform stiff with dried blood. And yet, as the clock crept past 2 in the morning, he prepared again for the next German assault. The town hall, where he had made his stand the previous day, was a ruin. Shellfire had torn away its strength, and tanks had blasted gaping wounds into its structure. Walls sagged, beams burned, windows shattered into jagged teeth of glass. Still, Vito clung to the wreckage, armed now with an M1 Garand rifle scavenged from a fallen comrade. His beloved Browning machine gun had been reduced to twisted metal by tank fire. But in his hands, even a rifle became a symbol of defiance. The Germans struck again with a preparatory barrage. Mortars and artillery rained down, smashing what little was left of the building. Plaster fell from ceilings, bricks tumbled in choking clouds of dust. The roof partially collapsed. Flames licked through the rooms, turning shadows into flickering ghosts. Any other man would have withdrawn, crawled away, sought shelter. But Vito stayed. He darted between windows, appearing suddenly to fire a few shots before disappearing again. To the attackers, it must have seemed as though a squad still held the building. In reality, it was one man, wounded and half-blind, refusing to yield. For 12 more hours, the fight continued. German infantry poured into the streets covered by armor. They advanced confidently, believing the final resistance was finished. But every time they drew close, shots cracked out from the ruins. Vito's silhouette would appear in one window, then vanish, only to reappear on the opposite side seconds later. He used the building like a stage, making himself seem larger, more numerous, more untouchable. German soldiers fell in the streets, confusion spreading through their ranks. They could not believe that one man was holding them off. By midday, the town hall was untenable. Fire spread unchecked, threatening to consume the entire structure. Ammunition was nearly gone. German forces pushed past the building, threatening the battalion's alternate command post a few hundred yards to the rear. Vito made a choice that once again defied the logic of survival. Instead of withdrawing to safety, he carried his rifle through the wreckage and made his way to the new strongpoint. If the Germans wanted Hatton, they would have to take him down first. At the alternate command post, he found another machine gun, damaged but repairable. Under fire, he knelt and worked with steady hands, cleaning, adjusting, coaxing the weapon back to life. When the next German assault came, he was ready. The narrow street leading to the command post became a funnel of death. For 20 relentless minutes, he fired burst after burst, mowing down attackers until the survivors fell back. By the time silence returned, bodies littered the approach, and smoke hung thick in the air. As the hours dragged on, the Germans tried again and again. Tanks advanced, infantry surged, mortars hammered, but Vito remained. His Medal of Honor citation would later state that he killed at least 40 enemy soldiers during those grim hours. The truth, hidden in the chaos of battle, was likely even higher. Every wave that fell back carried wounded and dying. Every attack broken against him bought time for the remnants of the 242nd Regiment to hold their fragile line. By January 11th, exhaustion had pushed Vito beyond human limits. He had been fighting without relief for over 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, his face blackened by smoke and gunpowder. His glasses, cracked and bent, clung to his face by sheer luck. His body screamed for rest, but his will refused. When American reinforcements from the 14th Armored Division finally broke through to Hatton at 2 in the morning, they found him still at his position, barely conscious, covered in blood, but unwilling to leave until formally relieved. Only then, with comrades finally at his side, did he allow himself to collapse. The aftermath of Hatton revealed the staggering cost. The 1st Battalion, 242nd Infantry, had entered the fight with over 700 men. By the time the shooting stopped, fewer than 300 remained combat effective. But the line had held. The German divisions, bloodied and exhausted, had failed to achieve their objective. Operation Nordwind would ultimately collapse, its desperate thrust blunted in part by one man's refusal to quit. Vito was evacuated to a field hospital, his body riddled with shrapnel and burns. Surgeons worked to remove fragments, treat infections, and stabilize him. Visitors who came to his bedside found a man who dismissed his own heroism. He told them he had only done what was necessary, only filled the role his comrades needed. But among the men who had survived because of his stand, there was no doubt. He was a legend. When the war ended, his deeds were recognized at the highest level. On December 18, 1945, at the White House, President Harry S. Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor. General Dwight D. Eisenhower attended the ceremony, eager to meet the sergeant whose story had spread across the European theater. Truman's words were simple: "You represent the best of America." Vito accepted the medal with humility, later keeping it tucked in a cigar box rather than displayed. To him, it was never about glory. It was about doing his duty when everything else had fallen apart. Life after war was not easy. Vito returned to Illinois, then accepted a presidential appointment to the Veterans Administration. In Chicago and later San Francisco, he devoted himself to helping fellow veterans secure benefits. He was relentless in advocacy, battling bureaucracy with the same determination he had once turned against tanks and infantry. He specialized in cases involving disability and trauma long before the term PTSD was widely understood. His own nightmares gave him insight into the invisible wounds of war, and he fought tirelessly to ensure no veteran was ignored. He married Patricia in 1952, raising a family while building a new life. In time, he left the VA and started a landscaping business in California. What others saw as barren hillsides, he transformed into gardens. He worked long hours under the sun, his hands as calloused as they had been in the mines of Illinois. To his employees, he was both demanding and inspiring, a man who never accepted impossible as an answer, but the scars of war never left completely. Patricia later spoke of nights when he woke from nightmares, disoriented, convinced he was still in Hatton. He carried the weight of memory, even as he channeled it into helping others. He rarely spoke of the battle, but every veteran who crossed his path knew who he was. His Medal of Honor remained quietly tucked away, a symbol not of pride, but of burden. In 1966, lung cancer claimed him at the age of 49. He fought the disease with the same determination he had shown in France, but it was one battle he could not win. He was buried with full military honors at Golden Gate National Cemetery, mourned by hundreds, family, comrades, veterans, and officials alike. His commander, Colonel Guy Kurtz, said in his eulogy, "When logic said retreat, when instinct said run, when overwhelming force said surrender, Vito Bertoldo said no. History did not forget him." Military academies studied his defense of Hatton as an example of individual initiative and determination. His story became part of infantry training, teaching new generations the power of one soldier's will. German accounts, including that of Colonel Hans von Luck, acknowledged the extraordinary resistance at Hatton. French historians credited his stand with saving not only soldiers, but civilians who would have been caught in a wider battle had the line broken. Decades later, documentaries and books brought his story to new audiences. In 2018, Netflix featured him in their Medal of Honor series, dramatizing his 48 hours of defiance with testimony from historians and veterans. Audiences were astonished that one man could hold off 2 German divisions, his courage transcending time and place. At Hatton itself, a memorial stands at the site of his stand. Every January, villagers and veterans gather to honor the sergeant who turned their crossroads into a symbol of defiance. The U.S. Army established the Bertoldo Award, recognizing soldiers who exemplify initiative and courage under fire. His family created the Bertoldo Foundation, supporting scholarships for veterans' children and funding research into combat trauma. His son, David Valor Bertoldo, carried the torch by serving in the Marine Corps during Vietnam, earning his own Bronze Star. His grandson, David Christopher Bertoldo, served in the Gulf War. 3 generations, bound by a legacy of service. Modern doctrine still draws from his stand. Lessons on mobility within defense, fire discipline, and the psychological impact of stubborn resistance all trace back to men like Vito. Infantry manuals cite his ability to maintain effectiveness under exhaustion and injury, showing that human resilience can equal or even surpass technology. Special Forces trainees study his actions as proof that courage and willpower remain the decisive edge in battle. At the 75th anniversary commemoration in 2020, American and French officials stood side by side in Hatton. Major General Thomas Vandal, representing the 42nd Infantry Division, told the crowd, "He was a cook who became a legend, a man told he could not fight, who instead fought."